What I'd like you to do is look at it contextually and from a little larger perspective than this room, but from the techniques, from the position of the techniques that are being used right now in Wisconsin, and answer philosophically, how does this stand up to the techniques of Alinsky?
Well, the first thing is you got to fight fire with fire. So the second thing is Wisconsin's happening without an Article 5 convention. The status quo is the thing that you're concerned about. And the question in my mind is just what is happening in Wisconsin? I see a lot of bark. I don't see a whole lot of bite. Do you? Our state legislators are holding strong because you know what? They're closer to the people, and the people want serious decisions to be made. That same dynamic in Washington, D.C., I don't think we could bet the same way. So I look at Washington, I look at Wisconsin, and I see a positive sign. I see public employee unions in the belly, or I should say in the place of their birth, which is what Wisconsin is. It's where public employees got their start, where they were first legitimized. It's the most powerful point in the country they could possibly be doing this. So far, they're running around making a lot of noise and accomplishing nothing because of the Tea Party's influence and the American people's influence having greater weight, relatively speaking, in the states than in Washington, D.C. Again, I'm not going to say the states are perfect. They're not perfect. It's a question of where is it better for us to fight. Would you tackle Karl Marx on the status quo, or would you tackle Karl Marx using Article 5?
In the front here.
Thank you. You know, I would like to encourage you with what your message is today. I think just like us as citizens have fallen asleep, right? We decided to wake up. The states themselves fell asleep, and they are starting to wake up. The Article 5, I believe in Article 5 because I believe that the state assemblies are going to be the key to reform. And I just want to encourage you to keep this path, keep this message strong. The Tea Party movement is strong in local and state governments, right? That is the strength of this grassroots movement. And to combat what's going on in Wisconsin, just like you said, it's fighting fire with fire. The Tea Party movement, 912 groups, independently named groups, can put pressure on state assemblymen, attorney generals, and governors like we can't do in the federal level. And so I would encourage you to consider this. And it's also a way that we can get off this generic mantra of limited government and responsible government and get behind a specific unity message. It's not like we're going to call from a hilltop, hold a convention, hold a convention. We're going to set the agenda. That agenda has to be defined, just like that first amendment that Nick brought up about the debt relief amendment. We set the agenda. We don't stand and yell at the assemblyman, hold a convention. We set the agenda, the specific unity message. This is what we are fighting for. And then we can get behind each other, even if there's another idea that takes place on how to get to that end goal. We can still support someone else when we know we are fighting for the same goals. And so I would recommend that you give this serious consideration. I believe in Article 5. I believe it is the most optimistic path to reform. It doesn't center around a national convention. We don't have to wait for November of 2012. Quite honestly, if we had our ducks in a row, it could happen in 6 months. It could happen as soon as we put pressure on those 34 states to hold a convention. One other thing, and I'm sorry.
We're gonna.
This to my hand. I'm sorry.
Okay. Thank you.
Hey, well, that was an easy question. There's got to be a skeptic. Come on.
In the back.
I've been involved with the Tea Party movement for the last year and a half. Some of the people that I'm working with just recently discovered the power of being a precinct committeeman. And what I'm suggesting is that as we try to develop our strength, I don't see a better way to develop strength and a voice than encouraging people to become precinct committeemen. If we do that, we can steer the votes of many, many people with each new recruit that we bring in to be a precinct committeeman. Now, we had a victorious event on January 22nd here in Arizona. We took control of our state chairman and the rest of the slate, and the Tea Party picks took the entire slate.
Thank you. Let's get this lady in the middle front here. And I'd like to ask you if you could just keep your comments or questions to under a minute. That would be great. We want to make sure we can hear from as many people as possible.
I have one question. First, I'd like to say that I really enjoyed the presentation, learned a great deal. But at the very beginning, you made the comment that many of the people that you really admired had serious doubts about this. And you didn't really list those. No. And it seems to me if you have an audience that you want to convince that this is the direction to go, that you should also present those and how one would overcome those doubts. And I didn't hear that, so would be
some of the people you wouldn't know, but to pick one name that as a person who warrants respect would be Phyllis Schlafly. She is very much opposed to this Article 5 convention, and I think it's simply because she is not considering the relative risks correctly. Her belief, her judgment is that the status quo is less risky. My belief, my judgment is quite the opposite. And it's literally also that we don't really have time to play with the status quo like we did in the 80s or the 90s any longer. We've probably only got about 10, 15 years left to actually make a change that can stop the direction of our country. So for me, this is a radically different judgment than for Phyllis. But aside from that judgment, that empirical judgment, I don't really understand their arguments to be any stronger than the ones that I knocked down. And if I'm misrepresenting the arguments that anyone out here has been hearing, or if there are additional arguments that you want to present to me, feel free to ask those questions.
Let's go over here a little bit to your right, Todd.
Please stand up. This is super glued to my hands.
Oh, all right, fine. Does the way you anticipate it working, like our Russell Pierce, the president of our Senate, would then contact the other people in the other state senates and say, let us bring this forth? I mean, how does the ball get rolling?
Oh, I'm glad you asked that question. Well, all right, you want to? The process gets going when states pass something called a concurrent or joint resolution, which is just a kind of legislation that a simple majority of the state legislature, both houses, well, unless you're in Nebraska, have to pass. That applies to Congress for an amendments convention, an Article 5 convention. You want to specify in that resolution the agenda. Currently, the National Debt Relief Amendment has been sponsored by Senator Sylvia Allen. The bill number eludes me right now, but it also is in the House. What's that? Oh, and we have the chairman of Restoring Freedom, which is supporting the National Debt Relief Amendment here.
Glenn Hughes, restoringfreedom.org. Glad to be here. It's my pleasure. This guy's incredible. He's helped us progress immensely over the last year and provided so much scholarship and knowledge. We would never be where we are today without him. Right now we have 10 states that have filed a resolution. We are optimistic that this year we will get 3 or 4. It's a small step, but we feel like it's a big step, and we feel like once we get this ball rolling, it'll turn into a snowball as long as I can keep this guy in front of the microphone. Thank you.
Thanks, Glenn. Todd, let's go over here to your far right.
Thank you. Nick, thank you very much. I'm concerned that Arizona is not leading this parade. What's the problem?
No, there are folks who have the fears that we've discussed that exist in the Arizona state legislature. Most of them have been recently convinced. Senator Allen's bill was held up in caucus for some time and was only released now to a floor vote, and that's going to happen shortly. And we're looking, I think it's looking pretty optimistic there. It's more challenging in the House. There's a representative, Glenn can fill you in on the details. There's a representative there that's holding the bill and not letting it even be heard in committee.
Alan?
Talk to Glenn.
Thank you, Darcy. Wonderful presentation, Nick. And you know I am a skeptic.
I know that.
I know.
Alan Corwin is a skeptic.
Just to be clear, what you're asking is for the people representing other states to have their states petition Congress for the debt relief amendment. What's to prevent them from also asking for an amendment that guarantees us the right to keep and bear anywhere we go, and it shall not be infringed, which we'd all like to see, and to pick one from the other side, everybody's entitled to a free swimming pool, which the news media would love, and tag on. How do you limit it to the one relief amendment you want so that then Article 5 can be used carefully, I assume, on other things to control Congress? Very compelling that the status quo, what Congress does now, is out of control. This is the only balance. I see that. But how do you prevent another really cool amendment from being tagged on?
You know, you can't, right? I mean, government is stupid sometimes, and all you can do is control what you can control. You can put in your resolution, as Glenn has at Restoring Freedom, specific language that limits the agenda to that specific amendment, and all of history and custom shows that it will be respected. The founders intended for it to be used that way. Even if the worst case scenario happened and nothing but Hitler, Stalin, and Mao showed up at the convention and they generated, the communist utopia proposal, it still takes 38 states to turn it into law, or 13 states to block it. And I'll guarantee you, before that would ever happen, Congress would have came up with it on their own.
Are there any, Alan, thank you. Are there any other, I would like to hear from some skeptics though, so maybe Nick, in answering another question, could answer it in a way that will satisfy what you've asked, Alan. Here in the front.
My question is about the NDRA itself. I'm sold on the idea of an Article 5 convention, but the NDRA seems like it's saying status quo. What we have now is good enough, and let's not go further unless the states say it's okay. I would like something like a Graham-Rudman sort of amendment that says keep rolling back.
Yeah, Bill, I'm with you. This is a beachhead. Look, this is a process that has only been used successfully indirectly. It has masked political will in the past, which led then Congress to act first, and then the will went away. We have to stop that. We need states to actually start using this vehicle to success so that the threat of the balance of power in the states can actually cause the federal government to hesitate before they do crazy things like run up $14 trillion in debt, pass Obamacare, pass TARP. In other words, we want it to be a vehicle that's accepted, that's used, that the states have in their arsenal or in their toolkit to use. And so from my perspective at the Institute as a public policy scholar, what I looked for were ideas that would have the greatest chance of getting to 38 states. To do that, you've got to convince states like Illinois. You've got to convince states like Arkansas, right? You've got to have something that has some potential crossover ideologically. I believe the National Debt Relief Amendment has some crossover potential because it doesn't specify don't raise taxes or do raise taxes or cut spending or don't cut spending. It just forces the government to stop kicking the can. And so, the left, if they want to support it, can support whatever they think their policy prescription is. All we're doing is doing something that everyone can agree on, that there's too much debt, there needs to be a limit on it. Washington is not controlling it. We need a counterbalance in the state. The power the states would have under this amendment would be in direct proportion to the irresponsibility of the federal government. All of those arguments, I think, have the potential for appeal on a cross-ideological way that maybe a balanced budget amendment doesn't, or a repeal amendment, which is another idea, doesn't. It's most important to me as a policy analyst to see a beachhead created so the process is validated and defined, and from there, sky's the limit.
Let's see. Boy, we got. And Todd, should I make him run over here or just?
I didn't know which way. Let's do it.
Let's get this young lady in the pink.
Nick, I'm wondering how close we are to the 2/3 states, 38 states, and which ones they are. I'm from Minnesota. I'm assuming we're not one of those states. We'd like to be,
Yeah.
but I'm a part of the Tea Party movement, one of the co-founders of the statewide group. Wondering what we can do to support the Tea Partiers in the 38 states so that we can make that happen.
Well, I appreciate that. Let me first emphasize that no application has reached even the 34 state mark yet. And the 34 state mark is necessary for the convention to be called, and then 38 states is necessary for it to be ratified. But we're not at the 34 state mark yet. There's incredible progress on the National Debt Relief Amendment. It's been filed in 10 states. We're looking optimistic in 2 to 3 already. Let me just back up and tell you a little history on this. The Balanced Budget Amendment got 1 or 2 states short of the 34 mark in the 1980s. It was spearheaded by Milton Friedman, and in an era of snail mail and facsimile machines and phones. In 7 years, he got to 32 or 33 states, depending on how you want to count, because unfortunately the applications weren't exactly identical. He did that in 7 years. Today we have the internet. We have conferencing. We have flights that are no longer regulated as monopolies. You can hop on cheap flights in immediate notice and get to hearings that are scheduled. So the communication possibilities that exist, the organization capacity that even the Tea Parties are demonstrating on a daily basis shows that this, if Milton Friedman could do that in 7 years, we can do that in 3 years, I think, or even less.
We've got time for about 2 more questions. Oh. Okay, wait for the microphone though, please. Todd, go ahead and run over there. And then we'll get your question. Okay, and then we're gonna get the fellow in the back, and then that's gonna wrap it up.
The question I have is, get it down a little closer to home, because I'm from Arizona. Who is the state legislator holding it up? Because if we can't get him to see the light, I guarantee you we can build a fire that you can feel the heat.
Okay. I defer to my boss.
I'm going to take this one because this legislator actually is a good friend of ours and almost always is eye to eye with us. And he is just, he needs a little more conversation about this. He's still concerned about the idea of a runaway convention. So when you call him, be gracious. It's Eddie Farnsworth. Okay? Thank you. And then this lady in green here.
This is it's not even a procedural thing. I noticed that you're taping this. I noticed that you're taping this. Will this program be available for us to share with others to propagate this information to the people that we communicate with?
What do you say, Darcy?
Yeah, yes.
How do we get it?
Well, Starlee Rhodes is our external affairs director, and she's waving her hand. And remember that name; it's easy to remember. Starlee Rhodes.
And then we've got one last question here in the red. Okay, we'll second to last question. We'll get this gal in the back.
My question is apparently, so this convention has never been called. Congress acted preemptively to keep a convention from happening. Are there any legislative routes that they can use to block the process, even if the right number of states said yes?
Of course. Look at all the gamesmanship that happens on a daily basis in Washington, D.C. Look, you cannot expect this process to be anything but challenging. It will be challenging. But look, just think of the political will that would be manifested if in 2 to 3 years, 34 states representing some 68, 67 individual state houses, representing some 2,500 state legislators. Imagine if the will arose from the states behind a particular amendment idea and then Congress tried to block it. At least you'd know who your friends are. Well, the difference is you'd have states with sovereignty, with police powers, with other options available to them, And it would immediately reveal the lack of any political legitimacy in Washington, D.C. in a way that nothing else could.
And last question.
Okay. So I got 2 quick points. The first one is how we as possible individuals could best help to combat the issue of the negative media that's being presented on the Tea Party in general. Because like you have the officials in Montana who are swearing to combat any Tea Party proposal that goes through. And then the second one is on your proposed budget amendment. How do you combat the argument that what about when the federal government does sometimes have to make those midnight budget increases in, say, a sense of national disaster or a national attack?
Well, I'm not sure what the first question was, but let me hit the second question. The second question is a legitimate one, and we hear it all the time. The argument is that it's not flexible enough to deal with emergencies. Well, I disagree with that, because all that the federal government would have to do is make the case for a contingency borrowing plan before anything happens and get the state's approval in place in the event of that. And they'd have to make it not all wild and, in other words, think of it this way. If everyone knows that these emergencies could happen, what is a rational person in the federal government going to do? Well, they're going to say to the states, okay, we need to borrow X dollars to just keep running, but then we also want to have a line of credit to deal with emergencies. Then they have to go to the states, and here's the difference between what they do now and what they would do under the NIDRAs. You would have to actually present that case in a way that could persuade 26 states that you weren't just screwing around and giving yourself a backdoor way to engage in wild debt financing. And I think that very process of forcing the government to define the contingency borrowing that they would need to convince 26 states well in advance of running around like headless chickens would be an incredibly powerful way to prevent the all too often use of an emergency to justify some excessive and irresponsible action by the federal government.
Great. Thank you, Nick. And
thank you, Darcy. Thank you all.
For those of you who have time to stay, you are certainly welcome. We have drinks and some light food. Please feel free to stay and mingle. A lot of the Goldwater Institute staff will be here and would love to talk to you and learn about what you're doing in your states. For those of you who are going back to the convention, I wanted to let you know that our litigation director, Clint Bolick, who many of you know, is speaking at a breakout session tomorrow called Waging the Education Revolution. It is hosted by the Bradley Foundation, but it doesn't have his name on it. So that's why we're letting you know that. It's at 11 a.m. tomorrow in room 221B at the Convention Center. And again, that's Clint on Waging the Education Revolution. So I'm sure he'd love to see you there. Thanks for coming tonight.